Thank you so much for joining me in my presentation of cannabis pests from top to bottom, including cannabis aphids, root aphids, spider mites, fungus gnats, and thrips. My name is Stacey Hickman, and I work for Natural Insect Control. Natural insect control was started in 1989 by Dave and Sandy Mitchell, who were growing vegetables organically, and they were having all kinds of problems with pests, so they decided that they wanted to use beneficial insects to be able to control their pest problems. They found it incredibly difficult to find insects that they could use and find companies that were supplying them. So they decided on their kitchen table that they would start a company called Natural Insect Control that would basically provide beneficial insects for any home gardeners, for greenhouses, anybody that needed them. It was a very simple idea that has grown a company into what we are today. Our mission is providing eco friendly choices for natural pest management and working with people in environmental stewardship to make a world a better place. This is brought to us every day by our wonderful owners who bring this message to us as we deal with our customers and help them with their pest problems. Some of the pests we're going to talk about today are new for cannabis. We'll talk about the cannabis aphid and root aphids, which are both fairly new for this crop. But there's also some pests that are still present when growing cannabis that's really important to think about: spider mites, fungus gnats, and thrips. What are aphids? Aphids are soft-bodied, pear-shaped insects. They can range in color from light green to red. Every aphid species has these two distinct tailpipes that hang out the back of them. They're called cornicles, which are actually used for a defensive spray when predators come into the area. Normally, you find aphids up on your growing tips, and they're always found in colonies. It's rare just to see one aphid. You normally see hundreds. The type of damage that is caused by an aphid infestation is leaf distortions. So aphids have this beak that they use to feed with. They poke it into the leaf surface. They suck the plant juices, causing that leaf to cup and curl and distort, and over time turn brown and die. They also leave behind a sticky honeydew surface on the surface of the leaves just below. This is their waste product. This usually can support different kinds of molds, so you know you have an aphid infestation when you have this sticky honeydew on the leaf surface and then also this mold growing on it. Aphids can also transmit viruses. Because they're feeding on a wide variety of plants, they can easily transmit viruses from one plant to another. But there are new aphid species that are found in cannabis in the last few years. The first one is the cannabis aphid. This particular aphid has been established in much of Europe and it's new to North America. In the last few years, I've only had one or two greenhouses that have had this aphid, but it is a very devastating aphid to have. It can cause significant plant damage and stress, resulting in wilting and yellowing of the plants. Most times, when growers see them, they will find these aphids right through the stalks of the cannabis, right on the stems. They are also a virus for vectors and other plant pathogens. Again, using that beak that they feed from, it's easy for them to transmit those viruses from one plant to another. How to identify this aphid, which is probably the most important thing because at a quick glance, all aphids look same, but there are some very distinct characteristics of the cannabis aphid. They vary in color from yellow to light green, and they have these three distinct stripes that run the length of the body. These stripes, once you start to recognize them, are readily easily seen on the aphids and is a distinguishing characteristic from all of our other common aphid species. If you get a chance to put this aphid underneath a microscope or a 10 times lens, you can look for these two finger or horn-like extensions at the base of the antennas. It's also another distinctive characteristic of this aphid species. How to deal with this aphid biologically? There has been some great work done with our common green lacewing and controlling this particular aphid species. Some general guidelines to using green lacewings: if you have 10 or less aphids, you use 25 larvae per square meter weekly. If you have up to 50 aphids, you want to increase the number of lacewing larvae that you use per square meter to 50. And again, you want to use that weekly until the aphids are suppressed. You can also use our common aphid control, Aphidolytes aphamyza, which is a little midge. It feeds on a wide variety of aphid species, and it can help suppress this particular species. It will feed in the small colonies of aphids. It will not go into the larger ones. You can also use ladybugs. Our common ladybug, Hippodamia convergens, can be one species that can be used to help control the cannabis aphid. It will work in the hotspot areas, managing those cannabis aphids and giving some suppression for them. Our next aphid that we'll talk about is root aphids. So we've just talked about the aphids that are on the top of the plant. We're now going to talk about the aphids that are on the bottom of the plant, and that is our root aphids. This is a cosmopolitan distribution of this particular species. It's been found in North America for the last 100 years. It can develop on the roots of the cannabis crop and it thrives in all growing medias, which means it is incredibly dangerous because there is no way from getting away from this particular pest. High, high root aphid populations can slow your plant growth, which over time will reduce your yields, which makes it very devastating. Root aphids are set up for perfect for indoor cultivation. And that's why they tend to stay with the cannabis, is that they have this perfect cycle for them to breed in. With cannabis, we have confinement. So the crop basically is confined to one area. So if one plant has root aphids, they can easily become winged and move to plants that do not. There is also lack of isolation between an old planting and potentially new plants that are coming into the area, again allowing those aphids to move easily from the old plants onto the new plants. There is also the technique of reusing pots that may have some soil or even live root material remaining in them to plant new plants with. This allows, again, a spot for the aphid to be on that live root material and infest a new plant as it's being repotted. The use of surface mulches can also favor this pest, again, giving it a lovely area that is protected so that it has a great place to breed, to increase its populations while it's being protected from everything else. Also, the indoor temperatures of cannabis really are preferable to this root aphid populations. At 25 degrees Celsius, the population doubles about every 1.5 days. So you can understand that this can get out of control really quickly in these indoor growing temperatures. But there is some hope out there. There is some biological controls that can help with this. The first one being entomopathic fungi, Bavaria, works very well to help suppress root aphids. I also have growers that use entomopathic nematodes, soil mites, namely Strelolalaps scrimatus, and rove beetles to help suppress root aphids. One really interesting monitoring tool that I did find was the use of sticky bands to trap the migrating aphids. What's really interesting about root aphids is they migrate up and down the stems of a plant. So the winged aphids from the top crawl down the stem to get to the soil. The aphids that are emerging from the soil crawl up the stem to get to the plant itself. So using a sticky band will trap both of this migration of those aphids up and down the stem of the plant. It may not give much in level of control, but it does definitely let you know what's going on with the aphids in your crop. Other pests to keep looking for in a cannabis crop is spider mites, fungus gnats, and thrips. Spider mites, in particular two-spotted spider mites, feeds on a wide variety of plants, from ornamentals to food crops to cannabis. It has a population that is dynamic. So what I mean by that is when spider mites start feeding, they lower the humidity and higher the temperature at the leaf surface, which actually results in increased mite population. So basically they are making the perfect conditions for them to mate, breed, and lay more eggs while they're feeding. This becomes even more important when you're thinking about spider mite control in terms of prevention. At a temperature of 15 degrees Celsius, it approximately takes a spider mite 37 days to go through its complete life cycle. As the spider mite population increases, it increases that temperature. That life cycle can shorten greatly. So when the temperature reaches 35 degrees Celsius, it is approximately 7 days for that life cycle, that same life cycle of the spider mite to go on. Spider mites like it hot and dry. Anything you can do to lower your temperatures, increase your humidity is going to help with spider mite control. Signs of spider mites, they do cause a yellowing and webbing, usually again on the growing tips of the plant. This webbing is like a silk thread that it allows it to move from plant to plant relatively easily by making a single thread. It also allows it to move on objects, mostly people as they walk through the greenhouse. Preventative spider mite control is incredibly important to think about. Our first line of defense is a predatory mite called Amblesius phallacis. This is a native predatory mite that feeds on a wide variety of spider mites and small insects. Almost any spider mite that you throw at it, it's going to feed on. It can remain in areas of low spider mites or even absent of prey as long as there's wind-blown pollen. What's really interesting about this particular spider mite is that it was originally found in an abandoned apple orchard here in Ontario. This orchard had had everything sprayed on it. So this particular spider mite is one of spider mite preventers is one of the few that I know of that actually has pesticide resistance bred into the strain that it is. So it can be used in a regular pesticide program if you want to try something for spider mite prevention. This one will be able to survive that environment. If you want to go beyond prevention and looking for some control for spider mites, you do have some options out there. There's Priscillus, there's Stepharis. Both of these are excellent options for that. Phytoceline priscillus is a tropical predatory mite. It's one of our oldest biocontrol agents. It was developed in the 1960s. The adults are bright orange, pear-shaped with long legs. Immatures are just a smaller version and lighter in color. Both the adults and the immatures feed on the eggs, nymphs, and adults of the two-spotted spider mite. What is really interesting about this particular predator is it will actually use the spider mite webbing to move from plant to plant to hunt down its prey. It's one of the few spider mite predators that will actually use the webbing. Most of them actively avoid those webbed areas. Priscillus will feed on 5 to 30 prey per day, so it has a big appetite for spider mites. If you need something else in terms of control, you can look at using Stethurus punctilium. This is a lady beetle like no other. It is a specialist just for spider mites, and again, it feeds on a wide variety of spider mites. Both the adults and the larvae feed on all stages of spider mites. What's interesting about this beetle prefers hot and dry areas, so think of this control at the very tops of your plants. If they have nothing to eat, they will feed on other things, arthropod eggs, aphids, pollen, and in a pinch, even their own species if there's absolutely nothing to eat. Moving on to our fungus gnat controls. Most times fungus gnats, people consider them just a nuisance. The adults do very little damage, while the larvae do all of the damage by consuming the roots of the plants. The only thing that adults do in terms of damage that some growers find difficult to deal with, and it is usually with the cut flower industry, is they leave behind waste material on the leaves of the plants, which can be unsightly and makes it difficult to sell that particular plant. When we think about the larvae, they do a ton of damage. They're most problematic for new cuttings and young plants because they are feeding on those root hairs. They do cause indirect damage by spreading pest mites, nematodes, viruses, and fungal spores because they are moving easily from pot to pot, feeding on a wide variety of roots. Their direct damage is root feeding. They do start off feeding on the root hairs, and when there is no other root hair to feed on, they start to move and feed directly on the roots themselves. Type of damage that they do is definitely all within the root ball itself. You can see the roots have been pruned, there is no root hairs present, and overall the plant begins to be very droopy because there is no roots to be able to support it. Some of our preventative controls for fungus gnats are a predatory mite called Stereolelaps scrimatus. It was formerly called Hypoapsis miles. Stereolelaps scrimatus is a soil predatory mite that feeds on a wide variety of larvae, including fungus gnats, springtails, beetles, and even pest nematodes. In terms of mites, it's a relatively large one, about a millimeter in size. It's easy to establish, which is a big benefit for this mite, and it prefers damp environments. The adults survive for 3 to 4 weeks without food, but they can also survive for a longer period of time, almost for the life of that plant, if there is organic matter in the soil. It sustains the population. They feed on all life stages of the fungus gnats, and they can eat about 8 larvae per day. What's really interesting about Streliolaelaps is it readily moves from plant to plant. So it'll go out the bottom of one plant and into another pot if in their first plant they have nothing to eat. So it's a great little mite to have around your greenhouse to be able to help with all kinds of soil pests. If you want something a little bit more than prevention and you're looking at treatment for fungus gnats, you can look at using beneficial nematodes. Stymernema felchae is a species that's used for fungus gnat control. What is a nematode? It's basically a microscopic roundworm, and what it does when it's applied to the soil is it seeks out a host, so it actively looks for a fungus gnat in the soil. Once inside the host, it releases its symbiotic bacteria, which kills the host. It reproduces inside there. Their offspring feed on the host itself and that bacteria and then move out of there to find new hosts to get into. This whole life cycle takes about 2 weeks, so it's relatively quick in terms of biocontrol, and it can work fairly well in indoor conditions. When the larvae are infested, they change from a white color to yellow to light brown, and they become very mushy. Thrips is our next one to think about, and in particular, western flower thrips. These guys are known as thunderbugs. They are activated as thunderstorms come through. The adult thrip is a very poor flyer, so it needs that thunderstorm to come through an area for it to be able to fly a longer distance. The adults are straw-colored with fringe wings, and the nymphs are cigar-shaped and wingless. They're very fast-moving and can be found on the leaf surface. Thrip damage is that they damage the leaf and flower tissue, resulting in a silvery appearance or a bronzing effect. They can also feed on the fruit and growing point distortions. They have these very powerful jaws that actually feed on the leaf material, causing again this bronzing effect, and also will feed on fruit if they can. They do transmit viruses. Tomato spot wilt virus is lethal to tomatoes and some ornamentals and has been found to be transmitted by our common thrips. One of the telltale signs that you have a thrip infestation is actually seeing the thrip waste material or poop on the leaf surface. It usually looks like a little black fleck or dirt material that is left on that leaf surface, and it is another sign that you may have thrips in your crop. Some preventative controls for this is Amblysius cucumeris, which is a predatory mite. These mites are small, pear-shaped, tan-colored mites. They feed on the immature stages of thrips, which also feed on pollen, two-spotted spider mite, and other mites. What's really interesting about cucumeris is they prefer to feed on the first instar of thrips. So a thrip egg hatches, the larva pokes its head out of the leaf surface, and Amblysius cucumeris comes along and basically prunes off that thrip. The older thrips that it can't feed on, it continually comes up behind them and it pokes them. So over time, they actually kill the thrips out of frustration. Cucumeris feed on about 1 thrip per day, and they live for about 30 days. A killer combination for thrips is trying to look at thrips as a two-pronged approach. So we use our Amblysius cucumeris up on the leaf surface to feed on those young thrip instars, and then we also use Hypoapsis miles or Streliolaelaps scrimatus in the soil to feed on any of the thrip pupa that might be dropping down to that soil. It's a killer combination to have both of these going on. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions at all, they can be sent to Natural Insect Control. Our email address is info@naturalinsectcontrol.com. Thank you very much.